Hey guys, tonight we're travelling somewhere deeply uncomfortable, into the medieval art studio. Not a cosy Parisian loft with natural lighting and a beret. I mean a cold, smoky corner of a monastery, where a monk with shaking hands and zero formal training was trying to paint Jesus, and instead produced something that looked like a surprised turnip wearing a halo. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to everyone who suggested tonight's topic. Honestly, your comments are what shape this channel, and I mean that. The fact that you keep showing up and suggesting ideas is the reason this keeps growing, and I'm genuinely grateful for every single one of you. We're also now live on Spotify, so if you'd rather drift off with this in your ears, the link is in the description. Now go ahead and dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and get properly horizontal. Maybe pull the blanket up to your chin, because we're about to go somewhere magnificent and baffling. Before we dive in, let's sit with a few questions. Have you ever stared at a medieval painting and thought, why does that baby look like a 45-year-old accountant? Why are the horses the same size as the buildings? Why does every face have exactly one expression, and that expression is mildly annoyed by God? Did the artist know it looked like that? Did anyone say anything? Was there a quality control system? Was there, at any point, a single person in the room who looked at the finished Christ child and said, actually, can we maybe redo the hands? And why? Why do the proportions only get worse the more important the subject is supposed to be? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1247. You're a monk in a drafty scriptorium somewhere in northern France. Your fingers are already stained with pigment. A sheep's bladder of yellow ochre just burst on your robe. And your abbot has just informed you that you're going to paint the Annunciation by Thursday. You have never taken an art class. No one has. Good luck. Let's start with the most obvious question. Who, exactly, was making all this art? The answer is both simple and deeply unsettling. For most of the medieval period, the people producing the images that decorated churches, manuscripts, and royal halls were monks, apprentices, and guild craftsmen who had learned their trade not from any formal institution, because formal art education as we know it simply did not exist, but from watching someone slightly older do it first. If you were lucky, that older person had watched someone even older, who had maybe copied a copy of a Roman original that no longer existed. If you were unlucky, you were essentially working from memory, prayer, and sheer optimism. There was no perspective class, no life drawing, no patient teacher telling you that human ears do not sit on the side of the forehead, or that a horse's legs, however you feel about it, do not all point in the same direction at the same time. Imagine starting your first day at a new job and being told, here is what your predecessor made, now make more of it, and by the way, your predecessor learned the same way. That was the entire art education system for the better part of 1,000 years. You absorbed what you could by proximity. You watched the senior monk mix his pigments. You were handed a brush and pointed at a patch of plaster that needed a saint on it by Sunday. You did your best, and your best, if we're being honest, was occasionally extraordinary, and occasionally looked like something a child drew on a foggy morning before breakfast. The apprenticeship model, which gradually formalized as guilds developed in the later medieval period, was at least an improvement. A boy, and it was almost always a boy, might be placed with a master craftsman at around age 10 or 12, and spend the next several years doing everything except the actual important painting, grinding pigments, preparing panels with gesso, running errands, watching. By the time he was trusted with a brush, he had absorbed a great deal simply through proximity. But what he had absorbed was his master's style, his master's habits, his master's particular way of rendering a hand or suggesting a fold of drapery. If his master had a slightly strange way of drawing ears, the apprentice had a slightly strange way of drawing ears. Generation after generation, small errors propagated forward like a game of artistic telephone. And here's the thing, this wasn't considered a problem. The goal was not originality. The goal was not self-expression. The goal was faithful reproduction of an established visual tradition in service of the church. Consistency was a virtue. If a saint looked a particular way, she should continue to look that way, because the congregation needed to recognize her. Innovation was, at best, mildly suspicious. At worst, it was heresy. You were not supposed to paint the Virgin Mary in a new way because the Spirit moved you. You were supposed to paint her the way she had always been painted, which was the way your master painted her, which was the way his master had painted her, going back in a line of careful, faithful, slightly deteriorating copies towards some original that nobody alive had ever seen. The result, spread across several centuries and an entire continent, is a body of work of wildly uneven technical quality, united by a set of iconographic conventions so deeply embedded that they function almost like a visual language, one that, once you learn to read it, turns out to be remarkably eloquent, even when the hands look alarming, even when the buildings are the wrong size. The message, more often than not, comes through completely. That might be the most extraordinary thing about medieval art. It worked, on its own terms, almost perfectly. Here's something that will immediately explain approximately 70% of everything strange about medieval art. Artists were not trying to paint what things looked like. They were trying to paint what things meant. This is a distinction that sounds philosophical until you actually look at a medieval altarpiece and realize that the Virgin Mary is roughly the size of a cathedral, the angels are the size of pigeons, and the donor kneeling in the corner is approximately the height of Mary's ankle. That's not a mistake. That's a theological statement. Important figures were big, less important figures were small. The landscape in the background wasn't meant to look like an actual landscape. It was meant to signal that a landscape existed. An artist in the 13th century would have found our modern obsession with realistic proportion frankly bewildering, the way you might find it bewildering if someone criticized a road sign for not being a photorealistic rendering of a stop. This is what art historians call a hieratic scale, the sizing of figures according to their spiritual importance rather than their physical position in space. And once you understand it, medieval paintings stop looking like mistakes and start looking like arguments. The large Madonna at the centre isn't large because the artist ran out of room for everything else. She's large because she is the most important figure in the image, and her size is a visual declaration of that importance that any viewer, literate or not, educated or not, could read instantly. The small kneeling figures at her feet aren't small because they're far away. They're small because they are human, and humans are, by cosmic measure, relatively small. Colour operated the same way. Red meant sacrifice, passion, martyrdom. Blue, especially the expensive lapis lazuli blue, imported at enormous cost from Afghanistan, was reserved for the Virgin's robe, because it signalled her unique status between the human and the divine. White meant purity, black meant mourning, green meant hope and new life. These weren't aesthetic choices, they were a code, and every viewer understood the code the way you understand that a red traffic light means stop without needing to think about it. Even the positions of figures carried meaning. A hand raised with the first two fingers extended was a gesture of blessing so standardized that a medieval congregation could read it from 50 feet away in candlelight. A figure with eyes cast downward was humble. A figure looking directly outward at the viewer was inviting contemplation. The direction a figure faced, whether they were shown full face or in profile, whether their eyes were open or closed, all of it was information, packed into the image with the same deliberate intentionality as the text it illustrated. The problem, or the thing that reads to our eyes as a problem, is that all this symbolic coding exists in direct tension with what we now expect from images, that they show us how things looked. We want the landscape to look like a landscape. We want the figures to be the right size relative to each other. We want shadows and depth, and the sense that this scene could, in some version of reality, actually have occurred in this particular light, in this particular room. Medieval painters were not trying to give us any of those things. They were giving us a map of spiritual significance, drawn with total confidence in a visual language we've mostly forgotten how to read. And the maddening thing, the genuinely humbling thing, is that within that forgotten language it all makes perfect, elegant, rigorous sense. You've seen them. Paintings where the background is solid, gleaming, unrelenting gold. Not gold-coloured sky, not a warm golden sunset, just gold. A flat, shimmering wall of it behind every figure, as though the entire scene is taking place inside a very holy jewellery box. To a modern eye, this looks strange, possibly garish, maybe even a little tacky. To a medieval viewer, it was the single most theologically correct decision an artist could make. Gold didn't represent wealth. Gold represented the divine light of God, uncreated, eternal, impossible to replicate with earthly colours. When painters laid gold leaf behind the Madonna, they weren't decorating her. They were locating her outside of time entirely, in a realm where shadows didn't fall and seasons didn't change. The fact that it also cost an absolute fortune and made the patron look magnificently generous was, of course, a complete coincidence. Gold leaf, actual, hammered, tissue-thin sheets of real gold was applied to panels and manuscript pages through a painstaking process that required a perfectly smooth, slightly tacky preparation layer called bole, usually a warm red or ochre clay, onto which the gold was laid and then burnished with a smooth stone or a dog's tooth until it gleamed like a mirror. The results, when done well, were genuinely astonishing. A gold-ground panel painting in the right light doesn't look like a painting with a gold background. It looks like it is generating its own illumination from inside, like the divine radiance is actually literally present in the object rather than depicted on its surface. That effect was entirely intentional, and it is, even today, startlingly powerful. This was the point. Medieval art was not meant to be looked at from a comfortable critical distance in a well-lit museum. It was meant to be experienced in a dim church, by firelight and candlelight, by people who had walked a long way and were, to varying degrees, frightened of dying and anxious about what came after. The gold didn't just look beautiful, it communicated physically and viscerally that this object existed in contact with something beyond the material world. It made the sacred present, which is a genuinely extraordinary thing to ask a piece of hammered metal to do, and which it managed repeatedly for several hundred years. The expense was also part of the point in a way that modern viewers sometimes find uncomfortable. The gold was not incidental to the devotional function of the object, it was central to it. Offering the most costly materials available was an act of worship. You gave God your best, which meant gold leaf, lapis lazuli, the finest vellum, the most skilled craftsman available. A cheap altarpiece made from inferior materials would have been, in the medieval understanding, not just aesthetically disappointing but spiritually inadequate, a mean offering, an insult dressed as a gift. And yet the gold also did something strange to the figures depicted against it, because it eliminated depth, because it removed shadow, because it refused to recede the way a real sky or a real wall would recede. The figures floated against it in a way that was neither fully here nor fully there. They existed in a kind of suspended sacred space, present enough to be seen and venerated, removed enough to signal their distance from ordinary human reality, which was, once again, exactly the theological point. These were not people you could meet in the street. They were intercessors, mediators, figures who existed simultaneously in this world and the next. The gold told you that, without a word, every time you looked. The gaudiness, it turns out, was a sermon. A very, very shiny one. Pick any medieval painting at random and look at the faces. Not at the gold, not at the robes, not at the suspiciously small buildings in the background. Just the faces. Notice anything? They're all more or less the same face. The same wide-set eyes, the same small mouth, the same mildly resigned expression that says, I have accepted my fate, and also possibly my damnation. It doesn't matter if it's the Virgin Mary, a Roman soldier, an angel, or a peasant watching from the side. Same face, different hat. This is not laziness, at least not entirely. Medieval artists were working from a completely different set of assumptions about what a face was supposed to communicate. Individuality was not the goal. Universality was. The face in a religious image wasn't meant to be a person. It was meant to be a type, a saint, a sinner, a holy mother, and the features that marked that type needed to be consistent enough that any viewer, anywhere, could recognize them immediately. Think of it less like portraiture and more like iconography, closer to the way we use symbols today than to the way we take photographs. You don't expect the stick figure on a bathroom door to look like any particular human being. You expect it to be immediately, unambiguously legible as a human being, and that is all you expect from it. Medieval sacred figures operated by a similar logic. The face of Christ was not meant to capture the specific physical features of a specific individual. It was meant to signal, at a glance across a dark church, in the flicker of a single candle. This is Christ. The long face, the centre-parted hair, the calm, slightly otherworldly gaze. These were a visual code, as standardized as a logo, and just as deliberately designed for instant recognition. What makes this genuinely fascinating rather than simply limiting is how much expressive information medieval painters managed to pack into those standardized features when they were working at the top of their ability. This sameness of the face is real, but it is not as complete as it first appears. Look closely at the eyes in a great medieval panel painting, a Duccio, a Cimabue, an early Giotto, and you will find that within the convention, within the formula, there is an extraordinary range of feeling, grief that is almost unbearable, a tenderness so quiet it takes a moment to register, a dignity so absolute it feels less like an artistic choice than a fact of nature. The constraint of the convention was not a ceiling. In the right hands, it was a scaffolding, and there's another layer to the flatness of medieval faces that is worth understanding. The deliberate suppression of individual personality was, in the religious context, a theological virtue. Painting a saint who looked too much like a specific, particular, unique individual risked locating her too firmly in the material world, making her too human, too contingent, too much a product of a specific body in a specific time and place. The idealized, slightly generic face kept her available, open, accessible to everyone who looked at her. She wasn't someone's aunt. She wasn't anyone you might recognize from the market. She was the Queen of Heaven, and her face was as universal as the concept she embodied, which is, when you think about it, a completely coherent artistic philosophy, just one that looks nothing like ours, and that our eyes, trained on 1,000 years of increasingly realistic portraiture, keep trying to read as failure. Nothing in the history of art is quite so reliably unsettling as the medieval baby Jesus. Not because of any malice on the part of the artists, not because of some theological dispute about the nature of infants, simply because medieval painters, who had almost certainly seen real babies in their lives, nonetheless produced images of the Christ child that looked absolutely nothing like one. Baby Jesus in medieval art has the body of an infant and the face of a 40-year-old man who has seen things. He sits upright with perfect posture. He gestures with the calm authority of someone giving a lecture. His eyes have the focused gravity of a tax collector. He's small, yes, but he is not a baby. He is a very, very small adult, and he's not pleased about being cradled. This is, again, completely intentional. Christ was understood to be fully divine from the moment of his birth, and depicting him with the soft, unfocused features of a newborn felt theologically inaccurate. There is a Latin term for this type of figure that art historians use, the homunculus, meaning little man. And that is exactly what the medieval Christ child is, a miniature, adult scaled down to infant size but retaining all the features and bearing of full divine authority. He blesses, he teaches, he holds a scroll or a globe with the competent ease of someone who has been holding scrolls and globes for years. He does not drool, he does not sleep with his mouth open. He has never in his existence experienced the confusion of a newborn who has not yet worked out what a face is for. He arrived in the world already fully formed, already fully in command because he was God, and God does not go through an awkward phase. The practical side of this also matters. Medieval painters, working without life models in most cases, without anatomical references, and without any systematic study of child development, found infant proportions genuinely difficult to render. Babies have very specific physiological differences from adults: larger heads relative to body size, shorter limbs, softer and rounder features, a particular quality of chubbiness around the joints. Getting all of this right requires either sustained observation of actual infants or the kind of formal study of anatomy that simply wasn't part of medieval artistic training. Most painters simply scaled down the adult figure they knew how to draw, and the result was the small, grave, slightly alarming divine infant that stares out at you from nativity scenes across 600 years of religious art. What makes this genuinely wonderful in retrospect is that the theological justification and the technical limitation happen to produce exactly the same image, and that image turned out to be genuinely powerful. The homunculus Christ child is strange, yes. He is a little uncanny, the way all things that don't quite behave like they're supposed to are uncanny. But there is also something arresting about him. He doesn't look helpless. He doesn't look vulnerable. He looks with those flat, steady eyes and that composed small face, like someone who is entirely aware of every dimension of the situation, which, theologically speaking, he was. The mistake, if it was a mistake, turned out to be the message. For most of the medieval period, nobody in Western European art had formally worked out how to make a flat surface look like it had depth. This sounds like a small technical detail until you actually look at what it produced. Tables that appear to be hinged in the middle, buildings that are simultaneously front-on and side-on, figures whose feet are at a completely different scale than their heads, and rooms that seem to be folding in on themselves like the worst IKEA instruction manual ever produced. Nobody found this alarming. For roughly 1,000 years, this was simply how pictures looked, and viewers had no trouble understanding them because the pictures weren't trying to be windows into a realistic space. They were more like diagrams, visual arguments about sacred events, laid out with the same spatial logic as a medieval text, where the most important word sits in the centre regardless of grammar. The technical term for what medieval painters used instead of perspective is intuitive space, which is a generous way of saying that they arranged things according to what felt logically correct rather than what would look optically accurate. Objects closer to the viewer were sometimes shown lower on the picture surface. Objects further away were sometimes shown higher. Buildings were shown from angles that revealed their most identifying features, rather than the angle from which a viewer standing at a fixed point would actually see them. floors tilted upward. Interiors were depicted as though their walls had been folded open flat, and all of this was completely legible to a medieval viewer, because they weren't trying to look through the painting into a fictional space. They were reading it like a page. Linear perspective, the formal mathematical system by which parallel lines converge to a vanishing point, creating the optical illusion of receding space, was theorized and codified in Florence in the early 15th century, primarily by the architect Filippo Brunelleschi and the writer Leon Battista Alberti. It is, when you think about it, a genuinely strange intellectual development. Someone sat down and worked out the geometry of vision, the mathematical rules by which a three-dimensional world projects itself onto a two-dimensional surface, and then wrote down those rules so that painters could reproduce them deliberately rather than stumbling toward them accidentally. This was not a discovery of something that had always been known. It was an invention, a specific historical moment when someone decided that painting should work like windows. Before that moment, for 1,000 years, they didn't. And the spatial arrangements that resulted, the tilted tables, the impossible rooms, the buildings viewed from 6 directions simultaneously, were not signs of ignorance. They were signs of a completely different visual priority. Why would you limit yourself to the single, frozen viewpoint of a person standing in one spot when you could show a table from above so that everything on it was clearly visible, show the facade of a building from straight on so that its architecture read clearly, and show a figure from the angle that best displayed their identifying attributes, all in the same image? The restriction to a single viewpoint is, from this perspective, the strange choice. And perspective, the great achievement of the Renaissance, was also, in a real sense, a loss. Picture this. You're a monk. You have spent 17 years perfecting your penmanship. Your letters are clean, your lines are even. Your script could make a grown abbot weep with its precision. You have one job, to copy texts, faithfully and beautifully, so that the word of God and the wisdom of the ancients can survive into the next generation. Then someone decides that the manuscript needs illustrations, and since you're already sitting there with the ink and nobody else in the monastery has a free afternoon, the illustrations are now also your job. This is the quiet origin story of a very large number of the strangest images in the medieval canon. The man who painted the Last Supper in the margin of your favourite psalter was not a painter who had dreamed his whole life of depicting the Last Supper. He was a very skilled calligrapher who was doing his absolute best under conditions of low light, limited pigment, and zero formal training in the human figure. The scriptoria of medieval monasteries were busy, serious places, not quiet retreats for contemplative creativity, but functioning production centres where the preservation of knowledge was treated with the urgency that it deserved, which was considerable, given how easily knowledge could and did vanish in the early medieval period. A monk assigned to the scriptorium was there to copy, not to innovate. Speed, accuracy, and consistency were the virtues that mattered. You work through a text methodically, line by line, column by column, and if your hand cramped, you stopped, shook it out, and kept going. If the light failed, you stopped and resumed the next morning. If you made an error, you scraped the vellum carefully with a knife and tried again. The text was the thing. The text was always the thing. The illustrations, the historiated initials, the full-page miniatures, the decorated borders, arrived as a secondary requirement, an embellishment that increased the value and prestige of the finished manuscript. In larger, wealthier monastic establishments, there might be a specialist illuminator, someone whose particular gift was for painting rather than lettering, and who handled the decorative elements while others handled the text. But in smaller houses, with fewer resources and fewer personnel, the distinction between scribe and illuminator was often simply the distinction between this week and next week. The person who had just finished copying the text was handed the pigments and asked to populate the empty spaces with figures. What's remarkable is not how badly this went, but how often, against considerable odds, it went rather well. The survival instinct of the visual tradition was strong. Even an untrained hand, working from an established iconographic model, could produce an image that functioned, that communicated the necessary information, that identified the right figures, that told the story clearly enough for its devotional purpose. The results were not always beautiful. They were not always anatomically coherent, but they were legible, which was what they needed to be, and occasionally in the hands of a monk who happened to have a natural gift for pictures alongside his gift for letters, they were something genuinely more than that. The constraints didn't always produce bad art. Sometimes they produced art with a raw, unpolished directness that no amount of formal training could have generated, images that are strange and vital and unforgettable in ways that technically accomplished work sometimes isn't. If the main body of a medieval manuscript is the polite composed surface, gold halos, serene saints, measured columns of careful script, then the margins are where the medieval mind let itself off the leash entirely. Illustrated manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled, in their borders and margins, with images that have no clear connection to the sacred text they surround. Knights fighting giant snails, rabbits hunting humans, hybrid creatures that are half monk, half fish, playing what appears to be a hurdy-gurdy, a dog in a bishop's hat delivering a sermon to a congregation of geese. None of this was accidental. None of it was the result of a sleepy monk doodling in the corner while the abbot wasn't looking. Or rather, some of it certainly was, but much of it was deliberate, and it was understood by contemporary audiences in ways that we can only partially reconstruct today. The snails deserve a moment of their own, because they appear so consistently across so many manuscripts from England and Flanders in the late 13th and early 14th centuries that art historians have spent considerable time trying to work out what they meant. Armed knights, clearly terrified, fleeing from or awkwardly confronting enormous snails. It's not one manuscript, it's dozens. It's a thing. Nobody has reached a definitive conclusion about what it means, which is honestly one of the more delightful facts about medieval art. The idea that there was a visual joke or a cultural reference so widely understood at the time that illustrators across 2 countries reproduced it for decades, and it has since become so completely opaque to us that we can only sit in front of it and admire the snails. The marginal imagery more broadly seems to have operated as a kind of counterweight to the solemnity of the main text, a permitted space for humour, social commentary, and the kind of earthy, carnivalesque inversion that medieval culture returned to repeatedly as a way of releasing the pressure of its own rigid hierarchies. The world upside down, animals behaving like humans, humans behaving like animals, the powerful made ridiculous, the lowly made triumphant, rabbits hunting the hunters, apes performing surgery, peasants in bishops' mitres. The image of a world in which the normal rules had been temporarily suspended was not subversive in any dangerous sense. It was licensed, contained within the margins, clearly framed as play rather than serious argument. But it was real play, genuine humour, and it tells you something important about the people making these manuscripts. They were not only devout, they were also funny. They were also bored sometimes. They also found the gap between spiritual aspiration and daily reality, extremely rich material for comedy. And occasionally, the marginalia are simply beautiful. Small animals rendered with an attentiveness and a tenderness that the main figures bound by iconographic convention could not always achieve. A hare sitting alert in a border, a small bird on a branch, every feather considered, a cat unmistakably a cat doing something entirely cat-like in the lower corner of a page that is otherwise occupied with the Annunciation. Whoever drew that cat had looked at cats. They had looked at cats carefully with affection and had reproduced what they saw with a directness and accuracy that their formal religious figures, weighted down with theological requirements, couldn't quite match. The margins are where the medieval artist got to simply look at the world and draw what was there. Modern oil paint comes in a neat little tube. You squeeze it out, you mix it on a palette, you paint, you wash the brush under a tap. Medieval pigments came from a somewhat different supply chain. The blue lapis lazuli, the most expensive colour in the medieval palette, more valuable by weight than gold in certain periods, was mined in a single valley in what is now Afghanistan and had to be transported across half the known world before it could touch a paintbrush. The red known as vermilion was made from mercuric sulfide, beautiful, vivid, and slowly poisonous with repeated handling. Lead white, which appeared in everything, was made by exposing lead sheets to vinegar fumes and scraping off the resulting crust. Certain greens were made from copper compounds that, over centuries, ate through the surfaces they were painted on, leaving holes where foliage once bloomed. Preparing pigments was skilled, laborious, and occasionally hazardous work. Lapis lazuli, once it arrived, at enormous expense, having passed through the hands of several merchants and crossed at minimum one mountain range, had to be ground to a fine powder and then processed to remove the grey impurities that clouded its colour, a process that involved kneading the ground stone repeatedly in a mixture of wax and oils, extracting the pure blue in stages over days. Get it wrong, and you had expensive grey dust. Get it right, and you had the most vivid, deeply saturated blue available anywhere in the medieval world, a colour so costly and so beautiful that its use in a painting was itself a statement about the patron's wealth and the subject's importance. Organic colours, reds and yellows derived from plants and insects, behaved very differently from mineral pigments and required their own preparation methods. Madder, extracted from the root of a plant, gave a warm red. Weld gave yellow. Woad gave a serviceable blue, used when lapis was unavailable or unaffordable, which was most of the time. Kermes, a red extracted from a scale insect found on certain oak trees, gave an intense crimson that was highly prized and correspondingly expensive. All of these organic pigments required not just grinding, but mordanting, the use of metallic salts to fix the colour to whatever surface it was being applied to, and their long-term stability was considerably less reliable than mineral pigments. Organic colours faded, shifted, changed in ways that altered the meaning of images over centuries. This is why many medieval paintings that appear to us as brown and ochre and subdued were, in their original state, startlingly vivid. Bright red robes, brilliant greens, whites so luminous they almost hurt. The fading of organic pigments over 6 or 7 centuries has given medieval art a quietness, an autumnal restraint, that is in many cases the opposite of what was originally intended. Strip away the centuries and you would be looking at something much more like stained glass, saturated, bold, deliberately overwhelming. The palette was not muted. The palette was loud, and it was making a noise that the chemistry of time has gradually turned down to a murmur. And all of it came from rocks, insects, roots, eggs, and vinegar. Which is, if you stop to think about it, one of the more extraordinary facts about the history of art. By the later medieval period, producing art in a city wasn't something you just decided to do one morning. It was a regulated, hierarchical, carefully managed profession, controlled by guilds, organisations that functioned as a cross between a trade union, a licensing board, and a very powerful neighbourhood association that you absolutely did not want to fall out with. Painters' guilds set the rules for who could call themselves a painter, how long an apprenticeship had to last, what materials were acceptable, and crucially, who was allowed to paint what. In some cities, the Guild for Painters shared membership with other craftsmen, who also worked with colour, saddlers, glaziers, mirror makers, because the distinction between a fine artist and a skilled craftsman was not one the medieval mind found particularly meaningful or important. Joining a guild was not optional if you wanted to work legally in most major European cities from around the 13th century onward. You served your apprenticeship, you worked as a journeyman, a qualified but not yet independent craftsman, travelling and working for established masters, and eventually, if you had the money and the connections and could complete a sufficiently impressive piece of work, you became a master yourself and could set up your own workshop, take your own apprentices, and finally, after perhaps a decade or more of working for other people, begin working for yourself. The piece of work you produced to qualify as a master was called a masterpiece, which is where that word comes from, and which started as a purely technical term before it became a compliment. The guild served real functions beyond simply keeping outsiders out. They maintained quality standards in a market where the buyer often had limited ability to assess the skill of the person they were commissioning. They ensured that apprentices received training, that journeymen were paid fairly, and that masters didn't undercut each other in ways that would destroy the economic viability of the trade. They also provided a social safety net of sorts. Sick members might be supported by the guild, widows of members might be permitted to continue their husband's workshop under guild protection. The system was not simply exploitation dressed up as regulation, though it was also sometimes that. But the discontents were real, and they were structural. The guild system was extraordinarily conservative by design. Innovation was not rewarded, consistency was. An apprentice who developed a better way of preparing a ground, or discovered a new pigment, or worked out a more effective compositional formula, had every incentive to keep that discovery within the workshop and every disincentive to share it publicly. Knowledge was property. Techniques were trade secrets. The practices of the workshop were proprietary in a way that slowed the spread of improvements across the profession and concentrated expertise in particular lineages and cities, which is why, when you look at the history of medieval painting, you see extraordinary leaps forward happening in specific places: Siena, Florence, the great Flemish cities, followed by periods of consolidation as other workshops absorbed what they could, and the field gradually levelled up. The guild system didn't prevent progress. It just made sure progress was expensive, slow, and happened on the guild's terms. Medieval artists did not enjoy what we might call creative freedom. They were not expressing their inner world or following their personal vision. The subjects, the iconography, the colours, the arrangement of figures, the emotional register, all of these were, to a very significant degree, dictated by the institution commissioning the work. The church had strong and specific opinions about how sacred figures should be depicted, which scenes from the Bible were appropriate for which locations, and what symbolic details needed to be present so that an illiterate congregation could read the image correctly. Paint the wrong number of wounds on the crucified Christ and you would hear about it. Omit the specific attribute that identified a particular saint: Catherine's wheel, Peter's keys, Sebastian's arrows, and the painting had essentially failed its function, regardless of how beautifully it was executed. This level of prescription extended to every element of the image in ways that would make a modern creative professional weep quietly into their mood board. The Virgin's robe was blue. Not sometimes blue, not blue when the painter felt it suited the composition. Blue, always, because the colour had been theologically assigned to her, and deviation was not a stylistic choice but a doctrinal error. Christ on the cross displayed 5 wounds: the hands, the feet, and the spear wound in his side, and those wounds were shown in specific locations, at specific scales, with specific visual emphasis, because the wounds were not decorative details but theological facts. Get the number wrong, and you would change the content of the image in ways that mattered enormously to the people who would be kneeling in front of it. Think of it like a legal contract, one with genuinely serious consequences for breach. The commission document for a major altarpiece would often specify not just the subject but the pigments to be used. Real lapis lazuli for the Virgin's robe, not the cheaper azurite that looks similar from a distance, because the church and the patron knew the difference, and the difference mattered. It mattered spiritually, because you offered God your best. And it mattered practically, because the patron was paying for lapis, and they wanted to be certain they were getting lapis, not a convincing imitation that would save the painter some money and fade to grey within a generation. The most detailed surviving contracts are extraordinary documents. They specify the number of figures, their arrangement, the colours of their robes, the quantity of gold leaf, the exact scenes to be depicted in any subsidiary panels, and occasionally even the emotional expression required. Figures were sometimes specified to appear devout, or grieving, or joyful, with the contract leaving the artist the narrow creative latitude of working out exactly how devout or grieving or joyful was supposed to look on a face built from the same formula as every other face in the tradition. Within all of this constraint, what's remarkable is how much individual character still emerged. Two painters working from identical specifications produced images that were unmistakably different in their handling of light, their sense of rhythm, their particular quality of attention, the specific gravity they brought to a familiar scene. The constraints were real and they were total, but the human hand holding the brush left traces that no contract could specify away. You can stand in a room with two Byzantine-influenced altarpieces from the same city, the same decade, the same iconographic program, and feel immediately that one of them is alive in a way the other isn't, that someone was present in its making in a way that goes beyond the execution of instructions. The church told artists exactly what to paint. It couldn't tell them how much to care. Before the widespread adoption of oil paint in the 15th century, the dominant medium for panel painting across much of Europe was egg tempera, paint made by mixing dry pigment with the yolk of an egg. This sounds deceptively simple, and it was, in the sense that a marathon is simply running. Egg tempera dried almost instantly, which meant you could not blend colours on the surface the way oil paint allows. You couldn't soften an edge or correct a shadow after the fact. Every single stroke was permanent the moment it left the brush. To build up tone and volume, painters had to apply dozens of tiny overlapping hatched lines, each one placed with absolute precision, building the form slowly from light to dark or dark to light, in a process that required immense patience, extraordinary technical control, and a very steady hand. A mistake made in egg tempera was not a mistake you could paint over. It was a mistake you had to plan around, disguise, or simply live with. The preparation alone was a substantial undertaking. The panel, usually wood, seasoned carefully to reduce the risk of warping and cracking, had to be coated with multiple layers of gesso, a mixture of chalk and animal glue that created a smooth, brilliant white surface for the paint to sit on. Each layer of gesso had to dry completely before the next was applied. When enough layers had been built up, the surface was sanded to a finish of almost porcelain smoothness. Any imperfection in the gesso would show through the paint. Any crack in the wood beneath would eventually propagate upward through the gesso and the paint layers and split the image. The surface you were about to paint on had taken days to prepare, and you would be working on it with a medium that gave you no margin for error. The egg itself had to be handled correctly. Too much yolk made the paint sticky and slow to dry. Too little made it brittle. The mixture had different working properties in summer than in winter, in humid weather than in dry. painters developed highly personal approaches to the exact proportions they preferred, the precise consistency they were aiming for, and these preferences were part of the craft knowledge that stayed within workshops and was passed down rather than written out. Your recipe for tempera was part of your professional identity, which sounds absurd until you remember that it determined the working properties of every mark you made for your entire career. And then there was the brush. Tempera demanded fine brushes, often very fine, sometimes a single hair's breadth, because the hatching technique required absolute precision at small scales. The brushes themselves were made from the tail hairs of small animals, or from the quills of birds, and maintaining them was a constant occupation. A brush that splayed or lost its point mid-stroke was not just inconvenient. It was a crisis, in the way that any equipment failure is a crisis when you are working with a medium that dries before you can stop to think. What tempera couldn't do in terms of soft blending and atmospheric effects, it more than compensated for in luminosity. The brilliant white gesso ground reflected light back through the semi-transparent paint layers above it, creating a quality of inner light that oil paint, sitting on a darker ground, couldn't replicate. The colours of great tempera paintings, a Duccio, a Simone Martini, the early panels of Fra Angelico, have a clarity, a singing precision that is entirely specific to the medium. It is the light of a very clear morning, sharp and clean and without shadow. It suited, perfectly, an art whose whole purpose was to make the divine luminous. The nightmare of making it was, in the end, worth it. The illuminated manuscript is one of the most beautiful objects the medieval world produced, and one of the most physically grueling to make. A single illustrated Bible or Psalter could take a team of monks years to complete, working in a scriptorium that was, for much of the year, lit entirely by natural light coming through windows that had to be kept relatively small to preserve warmth. This meant that detailed, intricate painting was being done in conditions of inadequate lighting, in rooms that were cold enough in winter to make ink thicken and fingers stiffen, by men who sat in the same position for hours at a time, developing what we would today recognise as repetitive strain injuries, chronic back pain, and severely deteriorating eyesight. Monks occasionally wrote notes in the margins of manuscripts they were copying, not illustrations, just small personal comments that read like the world's earliest occupational health complaints. These marginal notes, called colophons, are among the most humanising documents of the entire medieval period. A monk at the end of a long copying session might add in tiny script at the bottom of the final page, "He who does not know how to write thinks it is no labour, but though 3 fingers write, the whole body suffers." Another complained simply that his parchment was bad, his ink too thin, and the light too poor, and invited the reader to excuse the resulting quality. One famous example records that the scribe's hand was cold. You read these notes across a distance of 800 years and feel, with startling immediacy, the specific physical misery of sitting hunched over a manuscript in an unheated room in northern Europe in January, trying to draw a border of acanthus leaves at a scale that requires the kind of steady focus that becomes impossible when your fingers have lost sensation. The materials themselves were laborious to prepare long before anyone picked up a brush. Vellum, the thin, smooth writing surface made from the skin of calves or sheep, required its own elaborate preparation, soaking the skin in lime, stretching it on a frame, scraping it repeatedly, while still wet to thin and even it, allowing it to dry under tension. A large Bible might require the skins of several hundred animals. The ink was made from oak galls, hard growths formed on oak trees in response to insect eggs, ground and dissolved in water with iron salts added, producing a dark brown-black liquid that bit into the vellum surface as it dried and was consequently very difficult to remove. The pigments for the illustrations came from the same supply chain of minerals, plants, and insects, described in every other context of medieval art, applied here at a scale and with a delicacy that required tools barely larger than a single hair. The monks who made these objects understood themselves to be doing sacred work, not just in the sense that the text was sacred, but in the sense that the labour itself was an act of devotion, a physical offering of time and skill and suffering in service of something greater. The aching back was not incidental to the work, it was part of it. And this understanding gave the work a quality of attention, a willingness to spend hours on a single decorated initial, to return to a face again and again until it was right, to maintain the quality of concentration across years of repetitive labour that produced objects of extraordinary beauty, objects that survived wars and fires and the dissolution of the institutions that made them and still sit in libraries and museums, radiating a quality of care that is immediately physically present when you're in the same room with them. If the face was medieval art's most philosophically loaded challenge, hands were its most technically punishing one. Hands are extraordinarily difficult to draw. They contain 27 bones. They can move in dozens of planes simultaneously. They are expressive in ways that are almost as legible as facial expressions, and they are almost never in a position of complete rest. For a painter working without life models, without anatomical reference, and without the benefit of any systematic study of the human form, hands were a persistent nightmare, and the evidence is everywhere. Medieval figures reach, gesture, bless, hold objects, and clutch robes with hands that range from the merely slightly wrong to the genuinely surreal, fingers that tape at suspicious points, thumbs that emerge from unexpected locations, palms that seem to have been borrowed from a different figure entirely. The specific challenge of hands in the medieval context was compounded by the fact that hands were theologically important. They were not incidental parts of the figure that could be tucked into a sleeve or hidden behind a robe. Hands blessed, hands prayed, hands held the instruments of martyrdom, hands accepted the gifts of donors, hands pointed toward heaven. They needed to be visible, and they needed to be legible. You had to be able to tell, from across a dark church, whether the hand was open in blessing or closed in grief, or raised in the specific gesture of authoritative speech. This meant that hands couldn't be fudged or generalized. They had to be specific, functional, communicative, and the more specific and communicative you tried to make them, the more the underlying anatomical uncertainty showed. Look at the hands in a manuscript illustration sometime. Really look at them. You'll find, with remarkable frequency, fingers that are all the same length, including the thumb, fingers that bend at locations that don't correspond to any actual joint, a palm that is wider than the figure's head, a fist that appears to be gripping something invisible from the wrong direction entirely. These are not careless errors. The rest of the figure is often rendered with considerable attention and craft. They are the specific signature of a draftsman who has learned to draw a hand from another drawing of a hand, rather than from a hand. The model was the model of the model of the model, and somewhere in that chain of copies the thumb migrated. What makes this genuinely interesting, rather than merely a catalogue of failures, is the occasional, startling exception. The manuscript or panel painting where the hands are suddenly inexplicably right. Not just adequate, but beautiful, rendered with a flexibility and an expressiveness that suggests direct observation. A painter who actually looked at their own hand or someone else's hand and drew what they saw rather than what they had been taught to draw. These hands stop you. They are warm and specific in a way that the faces constrained by iconographic convention often cannot be. A hand holding a book in a 13th century miniature, every knuckle considered, the thumb hooked naturally over the cover, someone looked at that. Someone sat with their hand on a book and drew it, and that act of observation survived 800 years and reaches across them to remind you that a real person was present in this work, paying attention, trying to get it right. The failures and the successes are both, in their way, completely human. Here's a genre of medieval art that reveals a great deal about human nature and very little about religious devotion: the donor portrait. These are the small, carefully rendered figures you often see in the corners or lower registers of altarpieces and devotional paintings, men and women kneeling in prayer, usually significantly smaller than the holy figures they are depicted alongside, often identified by their coats of arms, their fashionable contemporary clothing, or simply by the fact that they are the only people in the painting wearing anything from this century. The donor portrait was the medieval equivalent of having your name on a building. You paid for the altarpiece, you funded the chapel, you commissioned the gilded triptych, and in return, you got to spend eternity kneeling in the presence of the Virgin Mary, your face rendered with considerably more individual detail than the saints surrounding you, because the painter actually had you in the room to work from. The theology behind this arrangement was entirely coherent, which made it also entirely convenient. Medieval Catholic theology held that acts of piety and generosity benefited the soul of the person performing them, not in a transactional purchasing your way to heaven sense, at least not officially, but in the sense that genuine devotion expressed through material generosity was a legitimate spiritual good. Commissioning a beautiful altarpiece for a church was an act of worship. Having yourself depicted in it, kneeling in perpetual prayer before the sacred figures you had provided, meant that your act of devotion was memorialized in the object itself, and that every Mass said in front of that altarpiece was, in a sense, accompanied by your prayer frozen in paint for as long as the painting survived. The practical effects of this arrangement were interesting for the art, because the donor was a specific individual living person who was going to look at the finished work and would notice if it didn't resemble them. Painters asked to produce actual portraits, studies from life, or at minimum from detailed preparatory drawings made in the donor's presence. This meant that in an era of entirely generic sacred faces, the donor figures were often the most individualized, most realistically rendered people in the entire image. A 15th century Flemish altarpiece might have a Madonna whose face has the abstracted, idealized quality of 200 years of convention, flanked by a donor whose wrinkles, whose specific jaw, whose very particular way of holding their hands has been observed and recorded with a fidelity that makes them feel immediate, present, and alive across 5 centuries. Sometimes the donors are so vividly rendered that they dominate the image despite their formal insignificance, small in scale, marginal in position, but so undeniably real against the beautiful artifice of the sacred figures that your eye goes to them first, which is probably not the theologically correct response. That particular short merchant in the lower left corner, with his impressive fur collar and his expression of someone who has paid a significant sum for this altarpiece, and would like the record to reflect that fact, he is more present in that painting than the angels hovering above him, and he knew it, and the painter knew it, and the angels, presumably, had opinions about this that they kept to themselves. Much of early medieval Western art inherited its visual conventions, its stylistic grammar, from Byzantine art, the iconographic tradition of the Eastern Christian Church centered on Constantinople. Byzantine icons are beautiful, powerful objects, and they are also, almost without exception, deeply, profoundly, categorically unsmiling. The figures in Byzantine art do not grin, they do not laugh, they occasionally look stern, they more frequently look as though they have accepted a great and solemn truth about the nature of existence and have decided to keep it to themselves. This was not a cultural accident. Smiling in sacred art was considered theologically inappropriate, even disrespectful, because the spiritual realm was understood to be a place of absolute transcendence beyond the petty fluctuations of human emotion. A laughing Christ suggested a Christ who found something funny, which raised all sorts of uncomfortable doctrinal questions about the nature of divine omniscience. Byzantine art reached Western Europe through several channels, through the movement of objects, through the influence of artists and craftsmen, through the major artistic centres of southern Italy and Sicily, where the Eastern and Western traditions overlapped and cross-pollinated, and its influence on the visual culture of the early medieval West was profound and lasting. The hieratic frontal figures, the flattened space, the heavy outline defining form against the gold ground, the specific standardized features of sacred figures, all of this flowed westward from Constantinople and shaped the visual vocabulary of Western religious art for centuries. When you look at a Romanesque fresco in a small French church and see Christ in majesty surrounded by the four evangelists gazing directly outward with absolute unnerving frontality, that is Byzantine inheritance, filtered through several centuries and several thousand miles. The solemnity was not simply a stylistic preference. It was, in the Byzantine understanding, a theological necessity. The icon was not a picture of a holy person. It was, in a specific and technically defined sense, a presence, a place where the sacred was genuinely actually accessible, where prayer directed at the image reached the person depicted. This understanding gave images a weight and seriousness that made casual treatment of them literally unthinkable. You did not put a smile on the face of someone who was going to be the focus of prayer, contemplation and petition, because that smile would be present every time someone knelt before the image in grief or fear or desperate need, and a smiling Christ receiving a grieving widow's prayer was a theological absurdity. Western art gradually relaxed this severity over the course of the medieval period. The Gothic innovations of the 13th and 14th centuries introduced more naturalistic poses, more emotional expressiveness, eventually even a gentle smile on the face of the Virgin that art historians have spent considerable time analysing. But the underlying solemnity of the Byzantine inheritance never entirely disappeared, and arguably never should have. There is something in the unsmiling direct gaze of a great icon, or a Romanesque Christ in majesty, that a more emotionally accessible, more humanized religious art cannot quite replicate, a quality of absolute authority, of presence without personality that is less friendly and considerably more powerful. The theological argument against smiling turned out, in the end, to produce some of the most compelling faces in the history of art. You don't forget eyes that look at you like that. You carry them with you, which was always the point. If you wanted a medieval artist to really let themselves go, to abandon restraint, to pile horror upon horror with something approaching relish, you gave them the Book of Revelation to illustrate. The Apocalypse was one of the most illustrated texts of the entire medieval period, and the results are some of the most extraordinary, inventive, and frankly disturbing images in the entire Western canon. 7-headed beasts, oceans turning to blood, angels with faces like the sun pouring bowls of wrath onto a screaming earth. The whore of Babylon, magnificently dressed and riding an animal that defies biological classification. Medieval painters threw themselves into these subjects with an enthusiasm that borders on unseemly, and the results demonstrate something important. When released from the obligation to render recognizable saints in familiar poses, a medieval artist could be genuinely, brilliantly strange. The Book of Revelation is, from an artistic commission standpoint, an extraordinary gift. It is specific, it names colours, numbers, types of creature, atmospheric effects, events, but it is specific in the way that surrealist imagery is specific, which is to say that the specificity is in the service of something that resists coherent spatial or logical organization. 4 horsemen, 24 elders, a woman clothed with the sun, a new Jerusalem descended from heaven, measured in cubits, an angel standing in the sun, crying to all the birds of heaven to come and eat the flesh of kings. These images demanded to be illustrated. They were vivid, they were visual, they were arresting, but they refused to be illustrated in any conventional compositional framework, because the world they described was not a world organized by the conventions of earthly, visual experience. The Apocalypse manuscripts that survive from the 13th century onward, particularly those produced in England, where the tradition was especially rich, show medieval artists at their most inventive and at their most unconstrained. The creatures that inhabit these pages are genuinely unsettling, not in a crude or clumsy way, but with the specific unease of things that are almost recognizable and therefore worse. A beast with too many heads wearing crowns, an angel whose face is the sun and whose feet are pillars of fire, a locust with a human face and a lion's teeth and the wings of a scorpion. These were not artistic inventions, they were descriptions from the text, which the artist was obligated to render as literally as possible. The obligation to literalism applied to a text that was itself deeply and deliberately non-literal, produced images that feel genuinely modern, closer to 20th century surrealism than to anything else in the medieval visual tradition. Death, plague, war, famine riding their various horses, these subjects gave artists the opportunity to paint destruction, chaos, and cosmic violence in a context that was not only permitted but required. The pleasure medieval artists took in the apocalypse is palpable on the page. The dragons are energetically rendered. The damned in the lake of fire have a quality of terrible specificity. The celestial machinery of bowls and trumpets and seals is laid out with the systematic care of someone who found the whole business genuinely compelling. It is art made by people who believed, completely and without reservation, in the reality of what they were depicting, and that belief, that absolute seriousness about the subject, gives even the most outlandish images a grounded, committed quality that makes them far more disturbing than they would be if they were merely decorative. Not all medieval visual art was paint on panel or ink on vellum. For the great cathedrals rising across Europe from the 12th century onward, the dominant visual medium was stained glass, and it operated by an entirely different set of rules. Stained glass wasn't viewed in reflected light. It was lit from behind by the sun itself, which meant its colours burned with an intensity that no pigment on a flat surface could match. Deep blues and ruby reds glowed like something alive. A figure in a stained glass window didn't need subtle modelling or careful anatomy. It needed strong, clear outlines, bold colour relationships, and readable silhouettes that could be understood from 60 feet below by a congregation that was, in all probability, not going to get any closer. The very flatness and simplification that looked like a limitation in panel painting became, in glass, a feature. Making stained glass was a separate and highly specialised craft, distinct from painting in both its materials and its technique. Coloured glass was produced by adding metallic oxides to molten glass during production. Cobalt for blue, copper for green, gold for red, creating sheets of colour that were then cut into the shapes required by the design. The cutter worked from a full-size drawing called a cartoon, using a heated iron to score and break the glass along the required lines. The pieces were then assembled with lead strips, called came, that held them together and formed the dark outlines that gave stained glass its characteristic appearance. Additional details, faces, folds of drapery, inscriptions, were painted onto the glass surface with a special pigment called grisaille, and then fired in a kiln to fuse the paint permanently to the surface. The great windows of the Gothic cathedrals, Chartres, Sainte-Chapelle, Canterbury, were not assembled by single artists working alone. They were the products of organised workshops of specialist glaziers who divided the work according to skill and function, some cutting, some painting, some assembling, the master glazier overseeing the whole and handling the most demanding passages. The logistics of producing windows that might be 40 feet tall and involve thousands of individual pieces of glass required a level of project management that would be demanding even by modern standards, conducted with medieval tools, in medieval conditions, for medieval patrons who had strong opinions and finite patience. What the medium produced at its best is arguably the most sublime visual experience of the entire medieval period. The light that falls through a great Gothic window on a clear morning is not light that has bounced off a surface and reached your eye at a reduced intensity. It is light that has passed through colour, been transformed by it, and arrives in the space of the cathedral as something that feels less like illumination than like the physical presence of something beyond the ordinary world. Medieval theologians wrote extensively about this effect, the way that coloured light seemed to materialise the divine, to make transcendence sensory rather than merely conceptual. Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, one of the great patrons of Gothic architecture in the 12th century, wrote about how the beauty of the church transported the mind from the material world to the immaterial. He was talking in part about his windows. He was right. Even standing in those spaces today, 800 years later, without the faith that built them, the light does something to you that is difficult to explain in any vocabulary that doesn't shade toward the spiritual. The Black Death swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing somewhere between a third and half of the entire population. It is difficult to overstate what this did to every aspect of medieval life, culture and imagination, including its art. Before the plague, religious painting was generally devotional, hierarchical and reassuring. Gold backgrounds, serene Madonnas, orderly processions of saints. After the plague, something shifted. Death entered the picture. Not as a background concept or a theological abstraction, but as a physical presence, grinning, dancing, absolutely delighted with itself. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became one of the most popular visual genres of the later 14th and 15th centuries, a procession in which death leads figures from every rank of society, pope, emperor, peasant, child, in an unstoppable dance toward the grave. The logic of the danse macabre was the logic of the plague itself. It took everyone. It did not respect rank, wealth, piety, or age. The pope died alongside the peasant. The knight died alongside the beggar. The infant died in the same week as the bishop. This absolute democracy of mortality, which the plague had made viscerally, undeniably real to an entire generation, found its visual expression in a genre of imagery that depicted death as a skeletal figure or a decomposing corpse, taking each figure by the hand in turn and leading them away, regardless of their protests or their earthly importance. The Pope might argue, the Emperor might resist, the young mother might plead, it made no difference. The dance went on. The effect on religious art more broadly was significant and strange. On one hand, the devastation of the plague produced an intensification of devotional fervour, more masses, more prayers, more commissions for altarpieces and votive images, as survivors sought to make sense of what had happened and to protect themselves, spiritually, from what might come next. On the other hand, the absolute failure of all available religious and medical frameworks to prevent or explain the catastrophe produced a quality of desperation, even of anger, that began to appear in sacred images in ways that hadn't been visible before. The suffering of Christ, his wounds, his pain, his abandonment, was depicted with a new physical intensity, a new willingness to dwell on the body in extremity, that reflected a culture that had just watched bodies fail, catastrophically, and on a mass scale. The image of the Pietà, the Virgin holding the dead body of Christ, the mother cradling the son she has lost, became one of the central devotional images of the later medieval period, and it is not difficult to understand why. Every person who had survived the plague had held a dead body, had mourned an unimaginable loss, had sat with grief so large it had no available form. The Pietà gave that grief a form. It said, "I know what this feels like." It was painted and sculpted thousands of times across the following century with an emotional directness, a willingness to show pain without softening it, that was genuinely new. Death had entered medieval art, and it had done so not as an abstraction, but as something that every person looking at the image had already, personally, met. Medieval Europeans were fascinated by the edges of the known world, partly because those edges were genuinely unknown, and partly because the classical texts they inherited were full of confident descriptions of the creatures that lived there. Ceopods, people with a single enormous foot which they used as a sunshade. Blemye, people with faces on their chests and no heads whatsoever. Dog-headed men, giants, people who lived entirely on the smell of apples. Medieval artists illustrated these creatures with the same earnest commitment they brought to saints and biblical scenes, because there was no clear reason to doubt them. The authority of an ancient text was significant. Travellers had reported strange things. Nobody who read about ceopods had been to the places where ceopods were said to live, and nobody who had been to those places had come back to definitively report the absence of ceopods. The classical source for most of these creatures was Pliny, the elder's Natural History, a Roman encyclopedia of the 1st century that covered everything from astronomy to gemstones to the animals of distant lands, with a quality of credulous inclusiveness that made it both enormously useful and, in retrospect, somewhat unreliable as a field guide. Pliny had collected his information from earlier sources, who'd collected theirs from travellers' reports and hearsay, and earlier sources of their own, and by the time the medieval world inherited and copied and glossed the text, the creatures it described had been accumulating authorial endorsement for centuries. You didn't doubt Pliny on dog-headed men any more than you doubted Augustine on grace. The authority was the authority. The medieval world's relationship with the monstrous was also, importantly, not simply one of credulous terror. Monsters served intellectual and theological functions. They were evidence, among other things, of the variety and inexhaustibility of God's creation, proof that the imagination of the Creator exceeded the comprehension of the creature. They raised interesting questions about the boundaries of humanity. If a creature had a human body but an animal head, was it capable of reason? Did it have a soul? Could it be baptized? These questions were not trivial to a medieval theologian, and the existence of monsters at the edge of the world, even hypothetical monsters, even monsters no one had actually seen, demanded serious engagement. Artists who illustrated the monstrous races faced a specific and rather wonderful challenge. How do you draw something that nobody has ever seen, that exists only as a verbal description, and that may not actually exist at all, in a way that looks convincingly real? The results vary enormously, from the touchingly literal, a figure that is simply a person with a very large foot, drawn exactly as described, with no attempt to make this look less bizarre than it is, to the more inventively realized, where the artist has tried to imagine what a chest-faced person would actually look like in motion, what problems they might face, what their daily life would involve. These images are strange and funny and occasionally quite beautiful, and they are, in their own way, a record of something real, not the creatures themselves, but the human capacity to take a description seriously and try to make it visible, regardless of how improbable it sounds. Among the most extraordinary objects produced by medieval craftsmen are reliquaries, containers designed to hold the physical remains of saints, a bone, a fragment of cloth, a lock of hair, a sliver of the true cross. The contents were, from a spiritual standpoint, enormously powerful. Contact with a saint's remains was believed to carry miraculous potential: healing, protection, intercession with God. The container, therefore, had to be worthy of what it held, and this produced some of the most technically sophisticated metalwork, enamelling, gem-setting, and goldsmith's art of the entire medieval period. Reliquaries were made in the shapes of arms, heads, entire bodies, a golden hand containing the finger of an apostle, a jewelled skull housing the cranium of a martyr. They were paraded through towns on feast days. The logic was impeccable, within its own framework. If the relic was holy, and it was, categorically and without question, holy, then the container that housed it participated in that holiness, and a container unworthy of its contents was a theological insult. So the goldsmiths and enamelers and gem cutters of medieval Europe turned their most refined skills toward objects that would, in many cases, never be fully seen by the people who venerated them, because the reliquary would be displayed at a distance or in dim light, or behind a grille, or enclosed in a larger shrine that only clergy could access. The craftsmanship was not for the human audience, it was for God and for the saint, and the quality of the workmanship was an argument about how seriously the community took its devotion. The shapes reliquaries took were sometimes straightforward, ornate boxes or caskets, architectural miniatures shaped like tiny churches or towers, and sometimes anatomically specific in a way that today reads as genuinely strange. An arm reliquary was a hollow arm of gilded silver, life-sized, terminating at the wrist or elbow, designed to hold the arm bone of a specific saint and reproduce in precious metal the form from which the bone had come. You presented the relic in the shape of the body it had been part of, which both identified the specific nature of the relic and made visible the saint's continuing, if transformed, bodily presence. It sounds macabre. In the medieval devotional context, it was instead a form of profound respect, the insistence that this was not merely a bone, but the bone of a person, a specific holy person, whose physical form retained its significance and its dignity even in fragments across 1,000 years. The making of a great reliquary was a collaboration between patron, theologian and craftsman, of a kind that produced some of the most technically ambitious objects of the period. The Shrine of the Three Kings in Cologne Cathedral, begun in the late 12th century to house the supposed remains of the Magi, is among the largest and most elaborate reliquaries ever made. A sarcophagus-shaped object nearly 6 feet long, encased in gold and silver, covered with hundreds of figures in relief, set with enamel plaques and precious stones, the whole thing representing decades of work by multiple goldsmiths of the highest skill. Looking at it today, even in a museum context, even drained of its original devotional meaning for most viewers, it is simply astonishing, not because it is showy, though it is, but because every square inch of it represents a decision, a piece of craft, a choice made by a specific human hand with a specific tool in service of something that person believed was genuinely, actually, cosmically important. That belief shows. It always shows. The reliquary is medieval art's purest demonstration of the principle that the quality of attention you bring to making something is visible in the thing you make, and that the highest quality of attention is the kind that doesn't know it's being watched. For large-scale wall painting, the dominant technique in medieval Italy, and increasingly in the rest of Europe, was fresco. Painting directly onto freshly applied, still-wet lime plaster. The chemical reaction that bonded the pigment to the wall as the plaster dried created an image of extraordinary durability, capable of surviving centuries. The catch was the timeline. A fresco painter was working against a clock measured not in hours, but in the precise moisture content of the plaster, which changed continuously from the moment it was applied. You had, depending on conditions, somewhere between half a day and a full day to complete each section, before the surface dried past the point of bonding. This meant planning every composition with military precision, dividing the wall into carefully calculated sections called journées, days' work, and executing each one without hesitation, revision, or the luxury of second thoughts. The preparation for a fresco cycle began long before a brush touched plaster. The wall itself had to be in the right condition, structurally sound, clean, not too porous, not too dense, and prepared with multiple rough plaster layers called oricio, onto which the full composition was sketched in a red-brown pigment called synopia. The synopia drawing was the painter's last chance to work out problems of proportion, placement, and compositional rhythm before the final plaster went on, and the commitment became absolute. Some frescoes were planned with cartoons, full-size drawings on paper that were pressed against the fresh plaster and traced through with a stylus or pricked with holes through which charcoal dust was puffed to transfer the design. Either way, by the time the final smooth intonaco plaster was applied, the painter knew exactly what was going on it and exactly how long they had to put it there. Working in fresco required a different physical discipline than any other painting medium. You were working on a surface that was still chemically active, still breathing, still changing under your hand. The pigments had to be mixed with water only. No binding agent, no egg, no oil, because the lime in the plaster was providing the binding, locking the colour into the wall's chemistry as it carbonated and hardened. This meant that the colours looked different wet than dry, that the painter had to work with a mental model of how each passage would shift in tone as it dried, and that the subtle adjustments available in other media, the chance to glaze a shadow darker, to lift a highlight, to revisit a passage that wasn't working, were simply not available. You painted it once, correctly, or you painted over it with dry plaster and started the section again. The joins between journat, the seams where one day's work met the next, were the most technically demanding passages in the whole enterprise, because they were where the continuity of the image was most at risk. A skilled fresco painter planned the joins to fall along natural edges in the composition, the outline of a figure, the corner of a building, the horizon of a landscape. In the greatest fresco cycles, Giotto's Arena Chapel, the upper church at Assisi, the joins are almost invisible, absorbed into the image with a fluency that makes the whole wall feel painted in a single uninterrupted movement. Finding them, when you know where to look, is one of the small pleasures of standing very close to very old walls with very good lighting. The seams of the days stitched invisibly into the fabric of an image that has outlasted every person who made it by 7 centuries. Here is something that would have baffled Leonardo da Vinci, and that the Renaissance went to considerable lengths to correct. For most of the medieval period, the people who made art were not considered artists in any meaningful sense of the word. They were craftsmen, skilled craftsmen certainly, producing work of great technical achievement and spiritual importance, but craftsmen nonetheless, categorized alongside the people who made shoes and barrels and iron hinges. The elevated notion of the artist as a creative genius, a person whose individual vision and intellectual gifts set them apart from ordinary labour, simply did not exist as a cultural concept in medieval Europe. A painter was someone who painted things. A sculptor was someone who carved things. The work was commissioned, the iconography was specified, and the execution, however beautiful, was understood as a service, more like printing than authorship. This categorization had practical consequences. Painters were not members of the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, which constituted the intellectual curriculum of the medieval university and defined what counted as genuine intellectual work. They were members of the mechanical arts, which were respectable in the sense that useful labour was respectable, but which carried none of the status of intellectual or scholarly activity. A university-educated theologian who commissioned an altarpiece occupied an entirely different social register from the craftsman who painted it, and the gap between them was not simply one of income, it was categorical. The theologian was a thinker, the painter was a maker, and making things with your hands, however skillfully, was a different and lower kind of human activity than thinking about the nature of God. The practical consequences of this were everywhere. Painters ate at the second table, not the first, when they were working in the households of noble patrons. Their names were often not recorded in documents that carefully noted the names of everyone else involved in a commission: the patron, the theological advisor, the notary who drew up the contract. Works of art were identified by their subject, their location, their patron, not by their maker, because the maker was functionally interchangeable with any other competent maker of similar objects. The idea that a painting's value was inseparable from the specific individual who had made it, which is so fundamental to our current understanding of art that it shapes everything from auction prices to attribution disputes, was simply not operative for most of the medieval period. And yet, even within this framework, individual reputations existed and mattered. Certain craftsmen were known, sought after, paid more, and travelled farther than others. The most skilled goldsmiths and manuscript illuminators operated at the highest levels of court patronage, and were treated, if not as equals, then as valued and protected practitioners whose specific abilities were understood to be rare and not simply replicable. Abbots wrote letters recommending particular craftsmen. Kings summoned particular goldsmiths from other countries. The market knew, even when the theory didn't, that there was a difference between the best and the rest, that the hand behind the work was not entirely interchangeable, that something particular and not easily replaced was present in the finest objects, and that it was worth considerable effort and expense to get it. The concept didn't have a name yet. The Renaissance would eventually name it genius. But the thing itself, the specific, irreplaceable quality of individual attention and ability, was already there in the work, waiting to be recognized. The modern idea of an artwork as the singular expression of a single individual was, in the medieval context, largely fictional, and nowhere more obviously than in the workshop. Medieval painting was, in practice, a collaborative and hierarchical production process. A master craftsman would accept a commission, design the composition, and complete the most important figures, faces, hands, the central sacred figures, while assistants and apprentices at various levels of skill filled in backgrounds, painted drapery, applied gold leaf, and executed the secondary and tertiary figures. The result was an object produced by multiple hands of widely varying skill levels in service of a single visual goal. This is why, if you look carefully at many medieval altarpieces, you'll notice that the quality of execution is strikingly uneven. The Virgin's face rendered with exquisite care, the angels in the background looking like they were executed by someone who had described angels to a distracted apprentice. The workshop system was not simply a practical expedient adopted because masters were too busy to do everything themselves, though that was certainly part of it. It was the normal, expected, institutionally sanctioned way of producing art at any significant scale, and it operated with a logic and an internal organisation that made sense within its own framework. The master was responsible for the work in its entirety, for its quality, for its theological accuracy, for its delivery on time and in accordance with the contract. The division of labour within the workshop was entirely his to manage, and a skilled master managed it by assigning tasks according to the abilities of his team. keeping the most demanding passages for himself while delegating the more straightforward, less visible, or more repetitive elements to assistants who could execute them adequately without requiring his constant supervision. What this produced, from a modern art historical standpoint, is a set of problems that have occupied scholars for centuries. Attribution, the question of which hand made which passage of a given work, becomes deeply complicated in a workshop context. Is the painting by the master and workshop, primarily by a senior assistant? These distinctions matter enormously to the current market value of medieval objects and to their place in the narrative of art history, which likes its geniuses singular and its masterpieces individually authored. But they are distinctions that the medieval period itself would have found largely irrelevant, because the work was identified by its patron, its subject, and its location, not by the specific allocation of hands within the workshop that produced it. Looking at a major workshop production from the medieval period with this understanding changes what you see in it. The unevenness of quality across a single altarpiece is not a flaw in the master's supervision. It is evidence of a living, functioning creative enterprise, a place where learning and teaching and doing were happening simultaneously, where a young apprentice's slightly uncertain rendering of a secondary angel's wings sits a few inches from the master's absolutely assured rendering of the Madonna's hands, and where both are present in the same object because that is how the object was made. The workshop was a world, and the altarpiece was its product, not the expression of a single consciousness, but the record of a shared and hierarchical endeavour, which is, when you think about it, how most of the interesting things in human history have actually been made. In the medieval imagination, the natural world was not simply the natural world. It was a text, a divinely authored system of symbols in which every animal, every plant, every stone carried a spiritual meaning that a properly educated reader could decode. This belief produced one of the most charming and deranged genres of medieval literature and illustration, the bestiary, a catalogue of animals, real, legendary and entirely imaginary, each accompanied by a description of its habits and a theological interpretation of what those habits meant for the Christian soul. The pelican was said to feed its young with blood from its own breast, and therefore symbolized Christ's sacrifice. The lion slept with its eyes open, and therefore symbolized divine vigilance. The beaver, and this is completely real, was said to remove its own testicles when hunted, to deny the hunter his prize, and therefore symbolized the virtue of sacrificing earthly pleasures to escape the devil. The bestiary tradition descended from a late antique Greek text called the Physiologus, which was compiled sometime around the 2nd or 3rd century, and which formed the basis for virtually every medieval bestiary that followed. The Physiologus described around 40 animals, each with a brief physical description and an allegorical interpretation, and its authority was such that medieval naturalists, using the term loosely, felt no particular compulsion to verify its claims against actual observation. The text said, "The pelican fed its young with its own blood." Therefore, the pelican fed its young with its own blood. Whether any of the people writing and illustrating bestiaries had ever spent time watching actual pelicans was, from a methodological standpoint, beside the point. The illustrators who produced the images for these texts faced the same challenge as the illustrators of the monstrous races, depicting creatures from verbal descriptions, without models, without any guarantee that the description bore a reliable relationship to the animal's actual appearance. The results range from recognizable to spectacular to completely baffling. The lion in a medieval bestiary sometimes looks reasonably lion-like. It sometimes looks like a dog wearing a very emphatic expression. The elephant sometimes looks like a credible large grey animal. It sometimes looks like a pig with a trunk attached at an improbable angle. The hyena, which the bestiary described as changing its sex annually, and therefore symbolized those who were neither faithful men nor chaste women, appears in illustrations that suggest the artist had heard a description of a hyena from someone who had heard it from someone else, and at some point in the chain of transmission, a lot of information had been lost. But here is the thing about bestiary illustration that lifts it above mere taxonomic confusion. The images are alive. The animals in the best medieval bestiaries have a quality of observed presence, of specific individual animal personality, that the formal sacred figures in the same manuscripts often lack. The reason, almost certainly, is that the monks who painted them had actually looked at animals. Animals were everywhere in medieval life. You could not paint a specific expression of canine alertness from a model of a model of a model. You had to have seen it. And so the bestiary tradition, for all its theological scaffolding and its cheerful disregard for zoological accuracy, contains some of the most vividly observed animal imagery in the history of Western art. Images of creatures caught mid-gesture, mid-expression, mid-existence, by painters who were ostensibly making theological arguments, but who were also, inescapably, paying attention to the world in front of them. Of all the challenges medieval art faced, perhaps the most philosophically vertiginous was this. How do you depict God? Not the incarnate Christ, whose human form gave painters something to work with, but God the Father, eternal, omnipresent, uncreated, beyond form and time and the capacity of human imagination. The theological arguments about this question were serious, sustained, and occasionally violent. Byzantine iconoclasts smashed images for decades in the 8th and 9th centuries, arguing that depicting the divine in any material form was inherently blasphemous, a reduction of the infinite to the finite. The Western Church eventually settled on an uneasy compromise. You could depict God, but carefully, and with appropriate symbols that signalled his incomprehensibility rather than claiming to represent him accurately. The symbols that developed for representing God the Father in Western medieval art are fascinating precisely because they reveal the boundary of what the tradition considered representable. In the early medieval period, God was most commonly indicated by a hand, just a hand, emerging from a cloud or from the top of the picture space, sometimes in the gesture of blessing, sometimes pointing, sometimes releasing, a dove toward the Virgin at the Annunciation. The hand stood for divine agency, divine presence, divine action in the world, without claiming to show the totality of the divine person. It was the minimum representation, just enough to indicate that God was present and acting in the scene without the hubris of attempting a face. Gradually over the course of the medieval period, the representation expanded. The full figure of God the Father, an elderly bearded man robed and enthroned, appears with increasing frequency from the 12th and 13th centuries onward, and by the late medieval period is more or less standard. The choice of an elderly man with a beard was itself a theological negotiation. The Old Testament described God as the Ancient of Days, an age signalled eternity and authority without quite claiming to be a literal portrait. The beard was borrowed from classical representations of Zeus and Jupiter, the dominant father god of the classical tradition, filtered through centuries of Christian adaptation. The white hair signified not decrepitude but timelessness. This was not what God looked like exactly. This was a conventional sign for the category of things that God was, rendered in the only vocabulary of bodily representation that the tradition had available. The Trinity presented its own special iconographic problems. How do you paint three persons who are also one God in a single image? Medieval artists produced a remarkable range of solutions, from the three identical figures of the Throne of Grace, Father, Son, and Spirit, arranged in a precise geometric formation, to the single figure with 3 faces, which was eventually condemned by the Church as insufficiently clear about the distinction of the persons. The anxiety about getting it wrong was real. A painting that implied the wrong theology about the nature of God was not just aesthetically unsuccessful, it was dangerous. It put ideas into the heads of an illiterate congregation that the theologians had to spend years correcting. The commission to depict God was therefore always also a commission to depict correct doctrine about God, and the gap between what paint could do and what doctrine required was a space that medieval artists navigated with more care, more seriousness, and more genuine intellectual engagement than they are usually given credit for. Not all medieval art was made for God, or not only for God. A significant portion of the painted and sculpted objects produced in the medieval period served a function that we would recognize today as political propaganda, the projection of power, legitimacy, authority, and identity by rulers, institutions, and families who needed the population to understand who was in charge and why that was right and proper. Commissioned altarpieces placed in prominent churches bore the donor's coat of arms, ensuring that every mass held in that space was, in a sense, an advertisement for a particular family's wealth and piety. Royal portraits, rare in the early medieval period but increasingly common toward its end, were produced not for private contemplation but for distribution to foreign courts, to regional governors, to anyone who needed reminding what the king looked like and how important he was. The most sophisticated political use of art in the medieval period was the construction of dynastic legitimacy. The visual argument that a particular family had the right to rule, expressed not in words, but in images that could be read by anyone, in any language, without the mediation of a text. A ruler depicted in the manner of a saint, surrounded by the visual conventions of sanctity, positioned in a composition that echoed devotional imagery, sometimes literally given a halo, was not being compared to a saint informally. He was being placed in a deliberate and calculated visual argument within the category of persons whom God had specially blessed and appointed. The image was the argument, and the argument was made every time anyone looked at it, which in a public church or a palace hall was many times a day. Civic art served parallel functions for cities rather than dynasties. The great painted programs of the Italian city-states, most famously Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Allegory of Good and Bad Government in the Palazzo Pubblico of Siena, painted in the early 14th century, were explicitly political objects, commissions that articulated what good governance looked like and what its benefits were, hung in the very halls where governors met to make decisions. The paintings were instruction and aspiration, and self-congratulation simultaneously. A vision of what Siena could be when its rulers were just, depicted in images of a thriving, beautiful, well-ordered city whose streets were full of people going about their business in safety and prosperity. The bad government panels, equally vivid, showed the alternative, a ruined, fearful landscape presided over by a tyrant, the city in decay, the fields abandoned. Come to the right meetings, make the right decisions the painting suggested, and look, here is what happens if you don't. The political sophistication of medieval art as propaganda is easy to underestimate, because the forms it used were religious forms, the visual vocabulary of devotion repurposed for civic and dynastic ends. But the repurposing was calculated and fully intentional, and it worked because it leveraged exactly the authority that religious imagery carried. To place your family's arms in an altarpiece was to associate your family with the sacred. To have yourself depicted kneeling before the Virgin was to claim, visually and publicly, a piety that the Church endorsed. The line between genuine devotion and strategic self-presentation was often genuinely blurred in the medieval mind. A wealthy patron who funded a chapel probably believed both that God deserved beautiful things and that his neighbours should know he had provided them. Both things were true simultaneously. A medieval art, pragmatic and theologically serious in equal measure, held both without apparent strain. Something began to shift in European painting toward the end of the 13th century and gathered momentum through the 14th, a gradual, tentative, and eventually revolutionary turn toward depicting the visible world as it actually appeared rather than as it spiritually signified. Giotto di Bondone, working in Italy around the turn of the 14th century, is usually given credit for beginning this shift, and looking at his surviving frescoes it's not hard to see why. His figures have weight. They stand on ground that looks like ground. Their faces express specific, recognizable emotions: grief, surprise, love, betrayal. They are not symbols of grief and surprise and love and betrayal. They appear to be experiencing them. This was not, by the standards of the preceding millennium, a natural or inevitable development. What Giotto did that was new was, in a sense, simply to look. Not to look at other paintings, though he had certainly done that, but to look at people, at the specific way human bodies occupied space and moved through it, at the way grief actually arranged a face, at the way a group of people standing together actually organized themselves in relation to each other. He introduced into sacred painting the specific, observed detail that his predecessors had systematically excluded, the detail that says this is not a symbol of a human being, this is a human being, and in doing so he changed what religious painting could mean and could do. If the figures in the image were people, really incredibly people, then the events they were participating in became, correspondingly, real and credible events. The lamentation over the dead Christ, in Giotto's fresco at the Arena Chapel in Padua, is not a devotional diagram of a sacred event. It is a depiction of grief so specific and so true that it functions, 700 years later, as a description of something universal about how human beings look when they have lost someone they love. The development was neither linear nor uniform. In the generation after Giotto, his innovations were absorbed, consolidated, and sometimes retreated from. The plague of the mid-14th century disrupted workshops and lineages in ways that set the development of Italian painting back by decades. In Northern Europe, the turn toward naturalism took a different path, driven by the possibilities of the new oil painting medium and expressed less in the monumental figure compositions of the Italian tradition than in the precise crystalline observation of surfaces, the gleam of a metal bowl, the texture of a fur collar, the specific fall of light through a window onto a tiled floor. The great Flemish painters of the early 15th century, the Van Eyck brothers above all, produced images in which the visible world was recorded with an attention so intense and so comprehensive that they feel less like paintings than like windows, not the spiritual windows of the medieval tradition, transparent to the divine, but optical windows, showing you exactly what was there with the uncanny completeness of a very clear, very still photograph. Both traditions, the Italian turned toward human feeling, the Flemish turned toward optical precision, were drawing on the same underlying impulse, the conviction, gradually strengthening across the 14th and 15th centuries, that the world you could see and touch and measure was worth depicting accurately, that the visible was not merely a veil over the spiritual, but something with its own dignity and its own truth. This was not a rejection of the religious tradition that had shaped medieval art. It was rather a deepening of it, a claim that God's creation, observed carefully and honestly, was itself a form of revelation. Here's the uncomfortable truth hiding at the centre of our fascination with medieval art. We don't actually see the world the way medieval people saw, It and medieval artists weren't trying to help us see the world at all. They were trying to help people navigate a universe that was, from top to bottom, saturated with theological meaning, a universe in which everything visible was secondary evidence for an invisible spiritual reality, in which the purpose of an image was not to record but to reveal, not to describe but to elevate. When a medieval painter made a figure large because it was holy, they were not making a mistake about spatial relationships. When they placed the scene outside of time by eliminating shadows, they were not ignorant of how light works. They were making deliberate choices within a visual system that had its own rigorous internal logic, a logic so completely different from the photographic realism that has shaped our eyes since the Renaissance that we can find it genuinely difficult to read. Our eyes have been trained, over the past 500 years, by an unbroken tradition of increasingly realistic image-making, perspective, chiaroscuro, photography, cinema, the endless photographic images that fill every surface of contemporary life, to expect images to behave like windows. We look at a picture and we expect to see through it into a space that works the way our eyes tell us space works, with depth, with consistent light, with figures that are the size they would be if they were actually standing where the image suggests they're standing. When an image doesn't behave like this, our instinct is to read it as a failure, as something that was trying to be a window and didn't quite manage it. Medieval art was not trying to be a window. It was trying to be something else entirely, and our failure to immediately perceive what that something else is says more about the limitations of our visual education than about the limitations of the art. Learning to see medieval art on its own terms is a genuine act of historical imagination, which is part of what makes it so rewarding. You have to work to set aside the expectations that 5 centuries of post-Renaissance visual culture have installed in your perception and ask a different set of questions. Not, why is this figure the wrong size? But, what does this figure's size tell me about its importance? Not, why does this space look flat? But, what does the flatness communicate about the nature of the scene being depicted? Not, why does everyone have the same face? But, what does the consistency of the face communicate about the universal nature of what these figures represent? The questions are different. The answers, when you find them, are coherent, sophisticated, and often genuinely beautiful. An aesthetic logic as complete and as demanding as any that Western art has subsequently developed. The alienness of medieval art is real, and it is not a problem to be solved, but an experience to be entered. It is the experience of genuine historical distance, of encountering a visual culture that was produced by people who were in many ways deeply like us and, in some fundamental ways, organized their understanding of the world quite differently. They lived in a universe in which the invisible was more real than the visible, in which every object and event was also a symbol, in which the purpose of a painting was to make the divine present rather than to record the world. Their art is the most direct record we have of what that universe felt like from the inside, and however alien it looks at first, the longer you spend with it, the more you find in it that is not alien at all. After everything, the mysteriously sized babies, the buildings scaled like toys, the forests of gold leaf, the hands that don't quite add up, there remains the simple fact that medieval art at its best is capable of stopping you cold in a museum corridor in a way that a technically flawless photograph sometimes cannot. The deep, unearthly blue of a Madonna's robe in a 13th century Italian panel, the expressiveness of a Byzantine Christ's face, which somehow across 900 years of cultural distance still reads as grief and love and authority simultaneously. The way gold leaf catches and scatters light so that an illuminated page seems at certain angles to be generating its own internal glow. Medieval artists were working within severe constraints of material, of knowledge, of theological prescription, of time and money and training, and they were not always working successfully within those constraints. But they were working in service of something they believed in with absolute totality, and that belief has a way of showing up in the paint. What medieval art got absolutely right was, above all, the communication of the sacred as something felt rather than merely understood. The theological precision of the iconography, the symbolic coding of colour and scale, the hierarchical organisation of space, all of these were intellectual achievements, and important ones. But the greatest medieval objects do something beyond intellectual achievement. They produce, in the viewer who is willing to be still in front of them, a quality of experience that is close to what the objects were made to produce, a sense of contact with something that exceeds the ordinary, something that the material world is normally opaque to, and that these specific arrangements of pigment and gold and coloured light make, for a moment, visible. This is not a small achievement. This is, arguably, one of the most difficult things that art of any kind has ever tried to do. The intimacy of the best illuminated manuscripts is something that no other medium quite matches. An object made to be held in the hands, opened slowly, read and looked at in private over years, a psalter worn smooth along its spine by the prayers of someone 8 centuries ago, carries a quality of personal relationship between maker and user that large-scale public art cannot replicate. The small figures in the borders, the tiny faces in the historiated initials, the marginalia that reveal a mind at play while the hand was working, these are traces of a specific, individual human presence, and the experience of encountering them across so much time has a quality of intimacy that is almost uncomfortable. Someone did this. Someone sat in a cold room, in bad light, and spent 3 days painting this border of flowers and small birds, and the flowers and birds are still here, still exact, still carrying the quality of whatever attention was brought to making them. Medieval art got right the understanding that making something beautiful, with care, in service of something beyond yourself, is one of the most fully human things you can do. It got right the idea that an object made with devotion carries that devotion forward in time, that it speaks to people who are not there and could not have been imagined. It got right the instinct that the things we make with our hands are a form of communication that outlasts everything else. The arguments, the institutions, the languages, the certainties, and that what survives finally is the quality of the attention. The monks who painted the margins, the goldsmiths who covered reliquaries with work that no one alive could fully see, the fresco painters racing the drying plaster. They were all making the same wager, that the care they brought to the work would be legible across any distance of time to anyone willing to look closely enough. They were right. It still is. So here we are. You've made it through 1,000 years of holy chaos, through egg and mineral dust and gold leaf hammered thinner than a whisper, through monks with frozen fingers painting angels by candlelight, through babies with the faces of tax collectors and horses that have never once seen a horse, through gold backgrounds that weren't showing off, they were showing you God, through hands that didn't quite work and margins full of knights who were, for reasons we may never fully understand, absolutely terrified of snails. And somehow, through all of it, through the bad anatomy and the flat faces and the plaster that wouldn't wait and the apprentices who were handed a brush and pointed at a wall and told to paint the Annunciation by Thursday, something survived. Something more than the objects themselves. Something that still reaches across 8 or 9 centuries and stops you in a corridor or a church or a library in front of something small and gold and worn smooth by other hands and makes you go quiet. Because what medieval artists were doing, underneath all the theology and the guild regulations and the egg yolk and the lapis lazuli hauled across half the known world, What they were really doing was the thing that every person who has ever made anything has been trying to do. They were saying, I was here. This mattered. I paid attention to this as carefully as I could with everything I had, and I am leaving the evidence of that attention here for you to find. They didn't know you would find it. They couldn't have imagined you, couldn't have imagined the world you live in, the distance you would be reading across, the strange blue light of whatever screen you have nearby. They were painting for a congregation they could see, in a church they could touch, in a century they understood. And yet here you are, and here it is, and the attention is still legible in the paint. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, extraordinary. So tonight, as you settle into the warmth you have and the comfort they didn't, your clean, flat, proportionally accurate world with its shadows and its depth and its central heating maybe carry a small thought for them. The monks with the aching backs, the apprentices grinding pigment in the cold, the master fresco painter racing the drying plaster, making decisions he couldn't take back, the goldsmith working by lamplight on the back of a reliquary that would spend 500 years in a locked cabinet where no one could see it, finishing it anyway, because it mattered anyway. They made things that lasted. They made things that still stopped people cold. They made things out of rocks and insects and egg yolk and sheer, stubborn faith, and those things are still here, still doing exactly what they were made to do, which is to remind you that the world is larger and stranger, and more full of meaning than it usually appears to be. And on that note, let the gold leaf settle, let the plaster dry, let the snail win just this once. Good night.